Alright folks, time for another rendition of Games Under 5 Hours. You all know the drill. I found a bunch of cool indie games under 5 hours long, and now I'm gonna tell you why you should spend the weekend playing them. This time around, we're getting surreal as hell. Do you like your horror trippy, your action on crack, and your adventure games cosmically far out? Because we've got all of those. And we're diving straight into the well of madness with Everhood. Okay, stop me if you've heard this before. Everhood is a sort of reverse rhythm game boss rush where every character in the world is their own unique boss fight where you have to dodge their attacks until they get tired and give up trying to murder you. It's got an absolutely gorgeous pixel art style, a big third act twist that leads to a whole big genocide versus pacifism moral quandary, an entire carnival worth of quirky random characters, and so many fourth wall breaks that it's more like the wall never existed to begin with. If your mind's already going there, yeah, it's difficult for Everhood to escape some Undertale comparisons, to the point where I've even heard it jokingly called Undertale 2. And if that's enough to sell you on it, then whip out your wallet and get to Steam. But in many ways, it feels more like the game's antithesis, both thematically and in what its priorities are as a game. Because mechanically, Everhood rips in a way Undertale could only hope to. It gets a surprising amount of mileage out of its whole reverse Guitar Hero shtick where you have to dodge all the notes on the board, almost every fight is genuinely unique, and it's actually a pretty stiff challenge. To put this in perspective, it featured a final boss that was such a no-holds-barred slugfest that it probably took me as long to beat as the rest of the game combined. And miraculously enough, I was actually having enough fun that I was satisfied bashing my head against it for that long. I am ecstatic with Everhood's rhythm boss rush gameplay, not just because of how meaty and challenging it was, but also because of the many surprising and creative ways that it expands upon its core mechanical ideas as the game progresses. There's also something to be said about Everhood's aesthetic. Between all the silly and minimalist world maps, there's a lot of brooding and really detailed artwork that's absolutely gorgeous. In everything Everhood does, it goes hard, both in its art and its music. If it wants to be brooding, it's dark and grim as heck. If it wants to be epic, it busts out a Dragon Force-worthy anthem. And if it wants to be trippy as hell, it doesn't shy away from being as weird as possible. Everhood's narrative is the only element I didn't find entirely satisfying, mostly because it's a little lacking on the cast front. There are a million quirky and lol-so-random characters running around to interact with, but exceptionally few that you actually get to really know or bond with beyond how quirky and weird they are. The overarching narrative is definitely good, and it comes with an interesting moral quandary to think about, but it's a bit lacking in actual fleshed-out characters to propel it forward and make the philosophy pondering personal. Overall, however, Everhood is a phenomenal ride. The gameplay alone is worth your time, and everything else is just gravy on top. Genesis Noir. Genesis Noir is a titanic collision between two very different stories. It is a straightforward story of love lost and refound, juxtaposed against the birth and death of the universe itself. A story that could not possibly be more micro and personal, allegorized through the most unimaginably cosmically massive lens physically possible. Oh, and if that wasn't enough, both of these interwoven narratives are told like noir detective stories with a huge helping of jazz. There is a lot going on here aesthetically. Like the Big Bang it references, Genesis Noir is pure artistic shock and awe, and if there's maybe a few sentences of actual plot mix somewhere in there, I neither noticed nor particularly cared. In that sense, it falls into a similar vein as something like, say, Sayonara Wild Hearts, where it's much more about going on a heavily stylized journey purely for the sake of it. And this game is chock full of chef kiss moments. There are so many occasions where this game is just heckin' beautiful, but there were also a surprising number of sequences that caught me off guard with how mechanically engaging they were despite their simplicity. Genesis Noir is a straightforward point-and-click adventure at its heart, but it's buried under so many layers of artistic flourishes and clever little mechanical twists that there is hardly a dull moment. If nothing else, play this game because the developers somehow designed a system that lets you play a sick jazz solo that'll sound good no matter how musically inept you might be. And I don't even know how you do that, but just, god damn, that's good. Dorfromantik. Just a heads up, I got a review code for this one. Dorfromantik is a sort of half city builder, half board game. At its most basic, it's a high score chasing game where you only have a limited pool of tiles to complete the objectives the game periodically gives you, like making a forest with X many trees or a town with X number of houses. But completing these objectives gives you more tiles, so it's all about trying to keep ahead of the curve and keep growing indefinitely. But sooner or later, you'll run out of tiles, and when you do, you get to look back at this gorgeous board of a quaint little countryside you've spent the past half hour stitching together. And it looks great every time. I just wish I could turn off the UI for 5 seconds to marvel in it. Longtime viewers might remember this one got mentioned way back in my itch.io bundle wrap-up, and since then, Dorfromantik has gone from playable vertical slice to full-blown game, so let's give it another look, because it's come a long way since. It's got more tiles to mix and match, more objectives to pursue, and the introduction of long-term challenges with a semi-steady stream of unlocks across multiple matches. And most importantly, this game actually has some strategic bite now. With the old vertical slice, you were kind of encouraged to make a blob of one tile going north and another tile type going south, and could just keep building forever pretty easily. But thanks to a wider array of objectives, you now have multiple conflicting priorities. For example, if you close your big main village off, you'll get some bonus tiles, but then you'll also have to start making a new village from scratch. And those conflicting priorities both deepen the game's strategy and make for a prettier and more interesting landscape once you're done making it. It's also all balanced fairly tightly too, where you're only rarely afforded the breathing room to start setting up for future potential challenges. That might turn some people off since it also means you don't have a whole lot of leeway for creative expression and have to focus more heavily on the strategy side of the game and staying alive, but for me, it made a really compelling core loop. Dorfromantik just recently came out in early access, and I'm not too sure what more they would even want to add to the game. As it exists now, it not only feels complete, but also pretty intricately and carefully crafted, as if adding more might throw the whole balance out of whack. What we've got is already a pretty great little game, so give it a look. Ender Lilies. Dorfromantik isn't the only early access title on this list. Ender Lilies only has about the first third of the game available, but it's still making an interesting first impression. Its main twist is primarily a narrative one, where instead of being a bad enough dude to beat up Dracula, you're instead a little girl who's mostly helpless, but can summon dead spirits to do all the fighting for her. And this spirals out into its own design consequences, like a malleable skill system that lets you swap out different attacks to build your own little custom character as you acquire more and more lost souls. Ender Lilies borrows from a lot of different places. It's got a very grim and gothic, basically anime Bloodborne aesthetic to it. Its main mechanical hook of beating bosses, then getting to use their attacks in your own repertoire is something that Castlevania itself has toyed with in the past, and it swipes all sorts of little quality of life mainstays like the bench and healing system from Hollow Knight. But put all these borrowed pieces together and you get something new and interesting. The setting may be your classic grimdark gothic horror, but the little anime touches, like how you summon the literal souls of the dead to fight for you, make it feel both cool and unique. And having optional bosses off the beaten trail to discover that will give you new abilities you can mix and match in your repertoire is exactly the sort of reward for exploration that a Metroidvania title thrives on. And the art on display here is fantastic, and its backstory cutscenes, its moody backgrounds, even the little details like its main character's dodge roll being more of a desperate dive, the art's pretty inspired and phenomenal looking. There's only really one place where Ender Lilies falters, and it's in its soundscape. The music is both sparse and relatively simple, and sound effects are done reasonably well, but not about to turn any heads. There's nothing actively offensive here, but it's also kind of the bare minimum, and it felt like a bit of a vacuum that I'm hoping gets fleshed out a little bit more as the game proceeds further into development. It's been a long time since I've played an early access game that actually feels like it's still cooking. There's the borderline placeholder feeling audio I just talked about, some animations are still a little stiff, and combat can occasionally get awkward when you overlap physically with an enemy. Ender Lilies is a little raw at times, but it's still good enough that its core appeal shines through, and it still shows a lot of promise. Even if you don't run out and pick it up today, this one is worth keeping an eye on, and the full version is already right around the corner for mid-June. Okay, that's everything for this quarter's wrap-up, but I've covered literally hundreds of... In case Devotion's reputation doesn't precede it, it's a pretty well-renowned indie horror game from 2 years back made by the Taiwanese developers Red Candle Games. But the game itself has been somewhat dwarfed by the real-life drama that surrounded it. The details of how one event exactly led to the next aren't entirely clear, but Devotion ran afoul of a lot of ire from China over some commentary about their president, culminating in the game basically being erased from the face of the internet. For 2 years, you just could not legally buy one of the most well-regarded indie horror titles in recent memory. But that all changed about a month ago because Devotion's back, baby! And available alongside Red Candle's other game, Detention, on the developer's store. So I couldn't resist the opportunity to finally check out what I'd missed the first time around and, do a little bit to support some wronged artists. But you don't have to be a bleeding heart to support Devotion. This game can easily stand on its own merits. Devotion has you repeatedly exploring an apartment house PT style, with a location evolving multiple times in creepy ways and making a few time jumps as you go through it over and over again. It's incredibly focused on filling its mundane setting with grounded, miniature details, and when it truly shines is when the surreal invades the mundane. At first, it's just a lot of unsettling details sprinkled into the apartment, but it slowly builds and builds until you're getting dream sequences and full-on nightmare hellscapes, and this is when Devotion had me hooked. Overall, Devotion is a phenomenal game. Its one potential fault is its jump scares, which show up every 20 minutes like clockwork, almost as if the developers are afraid you'll get bored and turn it off otherwise. But Devotion's true horror is a creeping existential one, rooted in the game's overwhelming melancholy, the slow reveal of what's going on, and the dawning realization of just what depths its main character will descend to accomplish his goals. The full crushing arc of Devotion's narrative is 90% wind-up and only 10% downswing, but it builds to a gloriously horrifying crescendo. And far more than any quick and dirty jump scare, that's what you should come to Devotion for. If, like me, you already missed your chance to play it once, don't pass that opportunity up a second time. Okay, so for real this time, that's everything for this quarterly wrap-up, but I've covered hundreds of great short games like these, so if you want more, you know where to look. And if you really want to see content like this flourish, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks for watching this far, and I'll see you all next week.